Let me say hello and welcome everybody. My name is Gina Waldhorn. I am the COO of the Sports Innovation Lab. And welcome to what might be week 6 of our Ask Me Anything series. We started this just a few days after lockdown and after sports were canceled, when it was a time we felt that connection and inspiration was more important than ever. So we kicked off this series and started inviting trailblazers and pioneers and thought leaders who were looking at this crisis as a time for action and innovation. So we've been speaking to NBA champion Paul Gasol, the commissioner of the A10 conference, the CMO of Spartan, the founder of the Drone Racing League, and really trying to find experts from within the sports industry, outside the sports industry, to have an open and honest conversation about the state of the industry today and the path forward. So today we're thrilled because we've found that across the industry, the legal ramifications of the sports cancellations are really coming into focus now. And it's really time where, the rubber hits the road and some important decisions need to be made. So today we have an attorney and legal expert with us today, Dan Lust. So we're thrilled to have this conversation. But before we do that, let me tell you how you guys can participate, because this is an Ask Me Anything. So we want you guys getting involved as well. So the way you do that, and before I tell you how to do that, let me just also let everyone know that you're on mute. Please stay there. We'll unmute you if we need to. We'll have you ask questions via the Zoom chat. This is being recorded, so if you have any, you need to jump off or you have any questions, you can go ahead and we'll send that link to you afterwards. So if you're looking to chat, please just go to the bottom of your Zoom screen, find the chat icon, click on that. It's going to go ahead and open a window on the right-hand side. You can choose to send the chat publicly to all the participants where they'll see your question, or send it directly to the host, myself and Josh, and your question will pop up right there. So that's how we get you participating. We want to hear everything that you guys want to ask Dan. So let me introduce our wonderful guest today. Dan Lust is an attorney at Goldberg Segalla, a nationwide firm with over 400 lawyers in 22 offices across the country. And Dan serves as a member of the firm's general liability and sports and entertainment practice. He's also a recognized commentator on sports law and the complex interplay between sports and emerging technology and the law. In the sports realm, Dan has parlayed his work experience within the New York Giants Public Relations Department into jobs in professional baseball and ultimately all-encompassing sports law. During law school, he served as president of Fordham's Sports Law Forum and created Forum's annual National Basketball Negotiation Competition. This has led to appearances on a vast array of topics on major programs, as we were just talking about, across the country on Sirius, among others, ESPN Radio, Fox Sports Radio, and CBS Radio. Dan serves as co-chair of the Tech Law Committee of the Westchester County Bar Association, and Dan was recently named a Rising Star by Super Lawyers. And hosting our conversation is not my son, I promise.
Sounds like your son. Bring him in. Bring Eddie in.
Eddie, second. Is Josh Walker, who is the president and co-founder of the Sports Innovation Lab. He leads over 60 of our clients in how to create breakthrough fan experiences. Josh also stewards all of the lab's research, where he was previously VP of Research at Forrester. And he also is really stewarding our leadership board program, which, like the AMA series, brings together senior executives from across the industry to push for change and innovation. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to you guys to get us started.
Thanks, Gina. I'll take it from here. You should get Eddie some lunch, I think, maybe. Hey, Dan, it's great to see you. Thanks for joining us. As Gina mentioned, I think this is a timely conversation, because what I have started to realize is that through the conversations I've been having with a number of our clients, they're starting to get into scenario planning and action mode. And a number of the topics that come up have so many interesting, convoluted legal ramifications when it comes to, giving people money back, dealing with employment law, struggling with sort of health and safety considerations, all things that sort of touch the world that you've been sounding off on social media. And I said to you before, and the reason we recruited you to have this conversation with us is we've got lots of lawyers in our world. I mean, the Sports Innovation Lab is not short on legal experts when it comes to all things media rights, valuation, large contracts, global expansion. We could have touched on any of those experts to come in and talk to us. What I wanted you to do is almost in an unfiltered way, the same way that you riff on social media and on air, is kind of like just go through a litany of legal ramifications that the industry should think about as we sort of bring sports back live. I don't feel like you're going to hold back. I've heard you speak. We're not going to get the party line. So I appreciate the unfiltered nature of the way that you've been putting yourself out there to begin with, but also would love to just tap on all of your experience that you've had over the last, almost decade now, to really hear where your head's at on some of these issues. So let's start at the highest level. Sports is coming back. A lot of people are starting to put calendar dates out there. At the highest level, we're talking about potentially bringing athletes back into an environment where potentially their health is at risk. What do the teams need to think about because they're their direct employer? What do the leagues need to think about? And what should fans think about as they demand to have live sports back? What kind of issues are really at play with these athletes from a legal perspective?
Sure. I'd be remiss if I didn't thank Gina for that lovely introduction, and Josh, you as well. I will try to keep this relatively filtered. We'll get some unfiltered, but we'll go to the big point. So I think first and foremost, my background as a general liability lawyer. So it's a fancy way of saying we do civil defense work. So now I knew my dog would pop up.
Your dog, Eddie, we're good. Let's roll.
Part of what we do just on an outside of sports, if there's an injury that occurs on site, be it, something falling on a construction site or someone slipping and falling, we have to ask ourselves whether the employer in that context or whether the landlord or, the owner of that site actually provided a safe means for that person to work. It's a pretty novel and easy concept to understand. Now, it gets a little trickier when that harm that's being caused is an airborne disease that we've never really dealt with before, and we don't know how to properly protect against it. So at a really high level, we've said this in 100 different contexts, right? This is really uncharted territory for the world, but also in the legal context, because what really defines what's a reasonable precaution in a certain context is the history and years worth of precedent that occurred before it.
So what's the actual
right.
legal, what is the actual legal framework? It's called reasonable what?
It's, I guess, you can't act in such a way to act carelessly towards, we'll say, guests or people that you're inviting onto your property as a homeowner, as someone that owns property or that is in control of property. So you need to take reasonable measures to protect those people on your property. You can't
reasonable measures is kind of the metric.
And here's the problem. Reasonable in the law is defined as, what a normal person would think, what a reasonable juror would think. And, when we're lawyers and I'm trying to give someone a value on a case or their chances of winning or losing, I, punch in Westlaw or Bloomberg or LexisNexis, and I find 100 cases that are on point. I find the particular jurisdiction, be it Brooklyn or Queens or, a different state, and I can give you a kind of idea if you're going to win or lose and how much exposure you're facing. The problem is when you're in a context where this has never been dealt with before, you really need to kind of just rely on people's kind of best guesses. And at a certain point, lacking any type of precedent in this context, again, we're at a super, super high level, and I'm happy to break it down. The foremost expert on kind of disease prevention when it comes to, COVID-19 coronavirus is Anthony Fauci, who's the head, expert in the country that does this. So whether or not you agree with what he's saying, he's a kind of a good barometer to look at to say, hey, what's reasonable under the circumstances? So if Dr. Fauci is saying sports can't return in any other context, which he said last week, unless players are kind of sequestered in a hotel and they're in kind of a bubble-esque scenario, he's saying that that's the safest way to do it. From a legal liability perspective, if you were then to disregard what Dr. Fauci said, and the standard is what a reasonable person would think is acceptable under that context, you would have a plaintiff's lawyer definitely hire someone that would say what Fauci said, or maybe even a step above that. So when you're trying to figure out when it's safe to come back, Fauci is a good barometer as to kind of your guide when there is really nothing else.
Right. So I think that's what all of our clients are struggling with what is reasonable and what is careless, and how much of this is security theater versus real implementation of things that would secure the health or well-being of their employees. So we have really two scenarios where they certainly, let's rule the fans out for a moment. We'll address that in a moment. But it's like the employees, the essential staff to produce a game, and it's the high priced athletes. So the scenario you just described is, okay, we need to have these athletes at least quarantined for 2 weeks, temperature checks, do all the things that make sure that they're safe to compete against each other. The employees leave the building, right? Under, even Dr. Fauci's recommendations, he didn't really address like the essential staff and the production teams that you would need to produce the games and how they'd have to come in and out. What would be reasonable, or what would not constitute carelessness around managing that population in this world? And I know that there's not a ton of precedent when it comes to pandemics, but what could you imagine from a legal perspective they should be considering with those employees?
So just so people have an idea of the numbers, it's being reported not domestically, but the Bundesliga, which is one of the big soccer leagues in Europe, they're saying that the smallest amount of people that they can run a game with, essential personnel, is around 200 people total, right. which is not a small amount of people. So it's this weird context, right? In order to do your job, you have to put yourself in harm's way. It's not that, now we're, Josh, what are we in week 6 of this, week 7 of this? There is starting to be some precedent that pops up. I mean, there was, not maybe at this point, it's not 2 weeks ago, there was someone, one of the Walmart employees passed away and now has sued Walmart in a wrongful death action. So there are measures you have to be taken. In that sense, he was arguing, this person that's passed away, his estate's arguing that they weren't provided with enough personal protective equipment, and that he made complaints that he wasn't feeling well, and that was disregarded. So there is a context to it. And I mean, again, what's reasonable under the circumstances? If you're going to be working at Walmart or an Amazon or a place where you're going to be in high traffic with a lot of people, maybe it's even more than 200, right? Because you're an essential business, right? You need to be able to ship packages. I would think it's a reasonable ask to give someone as many gloves as they could need, or masks. Sometimes in a certain context, right? Like I'm in New York, Josh, there weren't enough masks to go around for a period of time. So that's not something that the employer made a conscious decision and they were cutting costs and they were just trying to, save some money. If they really cannot provide any more means, if there wasn't a more safe way to do it, that's one thing. But when it comes to these 200 employees or so, you have to be very, careful as to, again, what someone like a Dr. Fauci saying. He's, at least on that little, barometer I'm giving you, he's just saying, at a baseline, you need to sequester them and make sure they're not going anywhere else, or in a situation where they could potentially, come into contact with someone outside of the bubble. So I think it's, again, your reasonable standard is what a reasonable juror would think. Conversations like this, conversations with your employees, with your own employees, to ask, maybe even to poll the room as to who thinks that this is reasonable, who thinks that we should be doing more. That's a decent barometer in a time like this.
So another question on this, and then again, I have so many topics I want to cover with you. I'll try to move on to ticketing and to the college sports stuff that's also impacted. But from an athlete's perspective, you are advising a high-priced athlete right now, and I'm making this up, and they say, look, Dan, I'm not comfortable going back under any conditions until this thing is cleared up. What legal kind of framework do they have to make that claim or negotiate that within the constructs of their contract?
So it's I know you're making it up, but it is a situation that's happening now in our country. I mean, the 2 biggest athletes in baseball that have brought this up are Mike Trout and Clayton Kershaw. For those that don't know, Mike Trout's probably the best player in baseball. Clayton Kershaw is among the best pitchers. And those are guys, like, for example, Mike Trout has earned $150 million in his career to this point. So Mike Trout is in an interesting situation. For those that don't know, Mike Trout's wife is due in August. So in order to participate in one of these bubble scenarios, he's going to have to be in strict isolation. And Major League Baseball is talking about picking a site, be it Florida or Arizona. There's a couple different plans that are out there, but sequestering players in strict isolation to be away from their families. So for someone like Mike Trout, right, he's not worried about maybe the risk of injury. Maybe he is, but he just doesn't want to be away from his family. In a different context, again, just jumping sports so people can catch the issues. there is a one of the main stars of WWE, a guy named Roman Reigns, was previously diagnosed with leukemia, and he's at this point doesn't want to compete in wrestling because he's at a higher risk of a potential harm from this. So he's not competing right now. The same, a different reason, but neither wants to compete. When it comes to baseball and the four major sports, those are unionized sports with the Players Association. So in order for Trout to refuse to play, he's going to be backed by the Players Association, right? If Trout's not going to play, they want to have some car, but maybe they're trying to negotiate, Josh, a scenario where he can play up until the point of his birth, come back and have, the quarantine for 2 weeks. But that's something that the union's going to fight for him. So if I'm advising Mike Trout, I would, and Mike Trout's the best player in all of baseball. I'm now Mike Trout's lawyer. I want to sit with the head of the Players Association and explain that you're going to have a whole host of issues with guys like Mike Trout and Garrett Cole, whose wife is also pregnant. Those guys aren't playing. It's going to throw the competitive balance off. Now, when it comes to a sport like a WWE or even like a NASCAR or another sport that's not unionized, you have a little bit of a different issue because there's just less protections. It's almost one-off.
Well, that's a really good segue to some of the questions that are starting to come in right now. So this isn't Ask Me Anything, so you're going to have to deal with my questions and then bob and weave, float like a butterfly, sting like a bee kind of thing. So Gina asked if there's, legal ramifications if obviously an athlete gets sick, and I think you covered some of that, but then there's another question from Ben, which is where you were just heading, which is, how does this apply to non-team sports like MMA or golf, where the athletes actually have a say? They're not under contract. Some of them are under contract, but they're under their own contractual. They're not unionized, things like that. Could UFC athlete take legal action against the organization if anything happens to them on their upcoming May 9th fight? Dana White's been obviously very vocal about trying to, continue to run UFC events. There's new golf tournaments that are being announced now between Tiger and other athletes being involved. So do they assume their own risk? Is there some sort of indemnification to the PGA or some other organization if they decide to compete?
Well, I think it's a good question that Ben asked. I mean, let's take two scenarios that we know what had happened. So a guy like Roman Reigns, and for the biggest show of the year for WrestleMania, it's their big ticket. He didn't want to compete in. So as far as we know at this stage, there's no we'll say ramifications on his employment. He's not being deducted his salary. And to your point, Josh, it's a question of whether he wants to go or not. If you want to compete, you assume the risk, but if you don't want to compete, there's no harm. It didn't go forward, but there was supposed to be a UFC event a couple weeks ago when Dana White was trying to buy this private island, which never materialized. But one of the main fighters in that fight, Khabib, and don't ask me to pronounce his last name, starts with an N. It's very long. It has a V in there, maybe a B as well.
I won't try either, but I know who you're talking about.
Yeah. The champ, he refused to compete. He was actually in a scenario where he was caught in Russia, just with the travel restrictions. He was caught there. So no, again, no ramifications on his employment. But and just think about it practically. If the event goes forward and one of your stars doesn't want to be a part of it, and he's not getting paid for his time, right? If he's not competing, he's not getting paid. It makes sense. The question is, once you get to the league level, and this is a question that I've kind of trying to been poking into. The only scenario that we have, Josh, that kind of resemble this, and I'll try to keep this short because I want to make sure we get to all the questions. 30 years ago when Magic Johnson had his HIV situation, that's a scenario where there were players at a certain point that were giving the indication that they were going to just boycott the league, that they didn't know enough about HIV. They didn't want to sweat on a court with Magic Johnson. They didn't understand how HIV was contracted between people. So completely different scenario, but there are some undertones, right? Everyone has different risk tolerances. Everyone has reasonable fears and maybe unreasonable fears. In that scenario, David Stern, the late David Stern was the commissioner of the NBA at the time. He basically, gave people a very intensive educational seminar of the risks of potentially contracting it. So that's probably what has to go on here before sports can go forward. Players have to fully understand and appreciate these risks before it could go forward.
All right, so I want to talk about as fans make their way back into the venues, because there's a number of questions that touch on this, but you've been very vocal about ticketing and refunds and season ticket holders and things of that nature. Where do the major ticket providers fall on this issue of I'm a season ticket holder, I'm holding tickets, should I get a refund? Do I get access to later games? I know these are all basically business decisions, but a lot of those tickets came with insurance or guarantees or some sort of waiver of rights to any future thing because of rainouts. There's all those contingencies printed on the ticket. Even digital tickets carry all that indemnification. So where are we with that sort of what rights do fans have in this scenario?
So for those that don't know, there was a very big lawsuit filed earlier this week in Los Angeles. It was originally brought by two fans, and they're trying to certify it as a class action. They're suing Major League Baseball. They're suing all 30 teams, and they're suing 4 ticket vendors, Live Nation, StubHub, Ticketmaster, the ones that you know of. What they're saying is that, hey, it looks like the season's going to be canceled. We've signed up for season ticket packages in some way, shape, or form. Someone had a partial season ticket package or whatnot. And that money was paid for in advance in most cases. So what they're saying is at this time, we'd like our money back because it doesn't look like the season is going to happen. So I guess from just a pure legal perspective, there's something in the law called, I'm probably saying it backwards, but a lawsuit can't sometimes it might be a good lawsuit, it might make a lot of sense, but it's not a ripe issue. At this point, we don't know if the season's going to be canceled. We don't know if the season's going to be moved back 2 months. And there is very clear, case law precedent. If there's a rainout, you don't get your money back. You just get access to the new game. Now, if any of these scenarios occur that are being put on the table, really across all sports, North Dakota is being looked at for NHL, Arizona for baseball, Las Vegas was being looked at for the NBA before a certain mayor's comments probably took them out of the running. But any of those contexts would really defeat the purpose of these tickets. So I think it's a lawsuit that at a certain point probably has some legs to it, but it's just brought a little too prematurely. So I've been getting the same question. Well, what is the impact of this lawsuit, if anything? Major League Baseball, and I'm sure the same lawsuit might follow in the NBA and maybe the NFL if we get there, but no one wants bad PR, and you can't sit on the decision forever. I know that there was an early indication that some refunds were going to be given, but I don't think at this stage, these ticket, be it Live Nation, StubHub, or any of these ticket vendors have an affirmative obligation to give refunds when at this point, we don't know how much of the season, if at all, is going to be played.
I'm trying to picture the lawsuit and how many are named in the case, because do you name Major League Baseball as, being responsible for some of this because they made those decisions? Do you name the teams? Do you name the ticket providers and vendors and secondary market? Like you could have a list of defendants and it's just, it seems like it's unwieldy at this point because we don't know where the season is going to shake out. Right. Is there a primary guilty party, the one that collected and I say guilty, I mean, is there a primary defendant because they collected my funds as a fan?
That's the difficulty with making this a class action because you have to have some commonality amongst the defendants. So, my family is San Francisco Giants fans. So we get San Francisco Giants tickets. I'm never going to go to Kauffman Ballpark in Kansas City. So I don't really have that much in common with them. I don't know how they bought their tickets. If they bought it through the stadium, I buy through StubHub. So there is some just kind of procedural issues right off the bat. But, as a whole, in theory, the lawsuit does make sense. Again, I think you have obviously the procedural issues we spoke about, but just premature. Nobody knows if sports are going to be canceled. Nobody knows if it's a protracted season. So I just think the lawsuit might, this lawsuit at this time, I just don't see it prevailing just at this stage.
I just picture again the bubble scenario where they're talking about playing all these games as triple headers in Arizona, and then they say to fans, "Well, your tickets are good if you want to go to this one area, be tested, etc." And that therefore sort of indemnifies them and keeps the money and like you could just picture all these conversations happening because they're happening with us, and so we kind of see where people's heads are going around these different scenarios. All right. Let's switch gears because, again, I think there's a lot more to talk about. Name, image, and likeness stuff is coming down the pipe. But we have Val Ackerman joining us in early May, who's been working on this, and she's going to cover that in pretty good detail. So I want to ask you more about sort of how this situation could impact college sports, because we have some experts saying, and Dr. Fauci's one of them, that this will change regionally, because there's certain areas that have been affected worse than others. So you certainly wouldn't open New York located universities immediately, but you may in some rural areas that have been less hit, or in California where the numbers have been lower, something like that. The idea that certain states can dictate opening certain universities or colleges sooner creates almost a disproportionate benefit for players who have already made early commitment to play in different universities. How does that even start to calculate in your head when it's like early commitment, even just kids transferring? Like, are they watching this? Should they be watching this? Is this just a short-term thing? Where's your legal framework on that? Can they retract their commitments? Like, under what sort of circumstances does this all play out?
So I think that as an initial point, I was kind of curious to see what would happen, because you have a state like Florida, which, Trump, on his press conference the other day, he said it a couple times. He wants states to decide when they want to, open up the doors to businesses and come back. So, just as a federalism issue, just as, if any lawsuits on here, it's, basic con law. States are allowed to do what they want, absent a national directive that says that they have to do something in particular. So, with Trump taking that stance, he's totally allowed to do that. It's in his right. And but that opens up a scenario where you have Florida, where sports are declared essential business. And in theory, right, Tom Brady can go to the Tampa Bay Bucks facility and work out, or the Jacksonville Jaguars, or the Miami Dolphins. That can happen in Miami. The reason I bring up the football context is because 2 weeks ago, the NFL and NFL Players Association came to a deal that said that no teams are allowed to go back to their own facility until all 32 teams are allowed to go back in their own particular states. So if New York is the last one hanging on, or I guess it's really New Jersey, and all other 49 states have allowed sports to come back, that still means that the Jets and Giants, because they can't come back, all 30 teams can't come back. Now, applying that to the college scenario, I expect that would happen, that the NCAA would pass a mandate that says across the board, no one can come back until all schools can come back. And to that point, in the college landscape, I know Mike Gund, he's one of the Mike Gundy is the head coach at Oklahoma State. What he's kind of said, and you're seeing this across the board in colleges, that it's really hurting the economies. But as bad as it's hurting the economies, being in Oklahoma State and these kind of we'll say college towns, that they don't want the college sports to start back up until students are on campus. And when it comes to name, image, and likeness, the reason for that and the kind of policy behind that is because students are not paid right now, because in exchange for their athletic services, they're getting a scholarship. So it would seem kind of unfair if someone would be competing and taking on all the risks of sports without getting any benefit of an education. And I think that the big issue, which at some point I'll probably write an article on this on a longer form, but you have a scenario now where college baseball and spring athletes were just given a full additional year of eligibility. When it comes to Major League Baseball, they've decided in a shortened season that now Commissioner Manfred has the power to shorten the draft from as many as 40 rounds to as few as 5 rounds. So, Josh, naturally, that's going to mean that a lot more guys are going to stay in college for that year, because they, signing bonus money and whatnot. Now the problem is, I have friends and I have, relatives that are graduating high school, be it on Zoom, probably something like we're doing, and they're going to college. Meanwhile, the college guys aren't going to the pros because they're getting additional eligibility. So you only have a finite amount of scholarship at these schools, and you've made promises to certain players. Hey, I'm going to come to your school because I want to start as a freshman and I want to be the point guard. And now you have a scenario potentially in football, if it gets kicked, or basketball, if it gets kicked, you have a logjam of players. So I don't see an easy solution for that. In a vacuum, you're going to have more talent at the college level, but you're going to have a lot of angry people. So I imagine the NCAA is going to make some exceptions in the transfer portal. You hope. You never know what the NCAA is going to do, but you hope that they would allow for some exceptions for this kind of logjam of scholarships that's bound to occur.
All right, I'm going to see if you can flex some European soccer knowledge. You understand the transfer market? I don't understand it that well, but let's see. Okay, mostly concerning European soccer, there's been a lot of talk about transfer and loan contracts and whether our players will or won't be able to play after their contract expires. So there's similar talk in the U.S. around sort of if a player's contract was good for only 1 year, does this year count, kind of thing. So typically around June 30th is when these contracts expire. If the season continues after that contract expiration date, then how will this affect rosters and player contracts for teams trying to finish the season but don't actually have the players to do it? So that could actually apply to any league, which is if the contracts expire and you don't have the number of players to do it, do you think that's where the league steps in and just changes draft rules or allows for an exceptional draft or transfer market?
I think so. And my knowledge of the transfer market solely comes from playing FIFA. So, you know,
That's good. That's good enough, man. I think a lot of people think they're experts because of FIFA, for sure. All right.
Yeah. So yeah, but the short answer is, you know, at least in the domestic landscape, the NBA draft or the NBA season now might finish in, we'll say, August or September. The NBA draft right now is scheduled for June 25th. So you can't have a season that goes and have the draft in the middle of this when the standings are still in flux. So I think you could just use pure logic that they're going to make the necessary adjustments. The NBA draft probably won't go forward then. Transfer market will probably be adjusted.
So Gidon asks a question: with the upcoming NFL draft, will the players look to have clauses in their contracts that protect themselves against situations like this that arise in the future?
So I'll hit that one quick. It's a very good question. So, you know, I don't think players individually can contract for force majeure. I mean, they'll look to the you know, the Players Association and the collective bargaining agreement. I think it's worth as a note on a very broad brushstroke. The NBA has a very clear force majeure clause that carved out that you know, even an epidemic, which is one level lower than what we're dealing with now, that counts as a force majeure event that could cancel the season and void payments to both sides. Major League Baseball has a clause called the National Emergency Clause. When there's a national emergency, if it causes games to be canceled, that's fine. That counts as a version of force majeure. There is no, we'll say, clear language in the NFL CBA or the NHL CBA that clearly spells out what triggers when a particular event happens. So what we've seen in the past 2-3 weeks, and you know, I'm trying to hit as much as I can on Twitter, we're seeing leagues come to these interim deals to kind of spell out exactly what would happen and what would require, you know, what would need to happen for sports to come back. Travel restrictions lifted, CDC guidance lifted. So I think in the future versions of CBAs, we're going to see that force majeure language in the NBA CBA kind of applied across the board. I think it's that transparency is really helping the NBA out now. And as we've seen, Josh, they've really been at the forefront of really all of this when it comes to, you know, the coronavirus and the impact on their game.
We had one of our advisors who's an expert in sports betting on one of our AMAs previously, Dr. Leila Mintis, and we asked her the same question. We asked Dr. Mintis, do you think that this situation and the need to recover revenue across the different states will accelerate some of the deregulation or the negotiations around regulating sports gambling in different jurisdictions, you know, reduce the battles over the integrity fees and, you know, the tax rates and things of that nature that we've seen stall out of this? I know you spend some time in the sports gambling world. What's your perspective on that?
So I think the fascinating development of it, and I mean, you know, let's just go back to Florida. I mean, I'm not, you know, I don't want to make any kind of political statement, but Florida is said, and they're again allowed to do this, that you know, when it comes to the spectrum of public health versus, you know, saving the economy, they've now in a couple different contexts said, you know, we're going to not close the beaches during spring break because it's, you know, the economy is essential into that sense. And now sports are declared essential business in Florida because of the economy. And there's just, they keep weighing toward that economic end of the spectrum. So when it comes to, you know, the we'll say external, internal pressures placed because they're losing revenue. I mean, I saw you guys have a wonderful chart on your site that's showing how much revenue is being lost, you know, in the billions from just sports hiatus. And then Josh, you also have to think on the back end, right? The longer this hiatus goes on, what's fans' tolerance going to be to go to games? I mean, if you don't have baseball for 6 months, you know, I remember the strike, you know, I wasn't, you know, obviously wasn't a huge fan back then, but my reading of it, 1994 baseball strike, fans didn't come back so quickly and it affected baseball for years to come. So I think that's in the back of owners' heads. And that's why you're seeing these kind of weird horse competitions or the, you know, the 2K league or whatever they're doing, video games, because they're trying to keep fans engaged. But I think there is a real worry that it's going to impact sports in the long run. And I saw a study, and I'm happy to send out that link. But you know, year over year globally, sports produced about $170 billion in 2019, and it's projected that They're going to really lose $70 billion off of that between gates, between TV sales. So it's by no means a small number. And truthfully, I mean, talking about English soccer, a lot of these teams could really be crippled. And there are reports, even minor league baseball, we're losing 40 minor league baseball teams. So we're already starting to see the effects that teams and potentially leagues like the XFL are going under because of it. So I definitely think that is really pushing forward the time frame.
So two things that came out of that answer that I know people have been asking is the minor league baseball closures. Touch on that again, let everybody know what happened. And then I'd like you to kind of touch on what that means for almost like Major League Baseball really starting to consolidate their own developmental league. And because the NBA gets credit for the G League and all of that comes with it. And there's some movement on that I'd like to talk to you about as well. But let's talk about baseball first. There was a negotiation that was going on between Major League Baseball and minor league baseball to contract the number of clubs. And because of this issue, because of the liquidity challenges that these local organizations were having, they've now reached an agreement to reduce the number significantly and bring those under the umbrella of Major League Baseball. Is that essentially what happened? Do you know what the terms were that they were negotiating on? And was this a talent issue, or was it just a financial issue? What were the legal issues around that negotiation?
Yeah, so it's really twofold. So even before this year, Major League Baseball was trying to have some type of, so we'll talk about numbers. I think it's, as of this year, there were 160 minor league teams across, spring ball and single A ball, double A ball, the Sally League, the Golf League, there's all over the board. The problem from a talent perspective, we, not that I watch the G League, but you in theory, you have one team that you know where to trace the talent. So when it comes to baseball, you have a scenario now where, there's so much talent spread out across the entire landscape. So I don't think that bodes well for ratings. And, let's say you have your 3 top prospects on your single A team or your double A team. That's obviously going to probably increase the gates. Whereas if you have 2 different teams in a high A league and a low A league, and you're splitting your stars up across the teams, it's double the expenses and whatnot. So I think that's been a concern for years, just in terms of gate, in terms of making sure that, you're going to lose some jobs along the way, but you're going to centralize your best coaches, your best staff to be with your players at all times. So that's been a concern of baseballs for a long time, just the extra expenses that were put into it. And the second, and I mentioned it, the second Manfred said that he now had the power to reduce the draft from 40 rounds to 5 rounds. It seemed like to me that the death knell was coming for minor league baseball in some sense. So 160 teams, assuming it's, they sign pen to paper, down to 120 teams. And that's being done to consolidate talent, to consolidate the right managers, strength coaches, and making sure these players are getting, top conditioning, top training throughout their progression in the minors. And also obviously increasing gates because, more consolidation of talent.
I mean, you don't need to be a rocket scientist to see the trickle-down effect of all of these decisions, right? You now have contract negotiations at the minor league level for these players that were trying to make it to the majors. You have all these, college kids that wanted to go pro and enter that draft. And you've got all these rising high school seniors that wanted to enter a league where they figured they would be able to get playing time. And now they're committed to a school where perhaps the seniors are sticking around. It's just this domino effect that just complicates everything.
It is, yeah. And then for those, my daughter Josh is 6 months old. Maybe in 17 and a half years, she'll be a star point guard for UConn or something like that. And I wouldn't be the happiest parent in the world if my kid was going to be blocked for an additional year. And I picked UConn in particular because there was a clear path for her to be a 4-year starter and whatnot. So I do think that that's a looming issue that we have to watch as more eligibility is extended.
So while we're still on this topic, the G League, a lot of buzz is being made now that, one of the top prospects is going to forego college and go directly to the developmental league. Do you see this as a positive for contract negotiations long-term for these players, or do you still believe legally and from a value perspective that their brand building in the NCAA is more advantageous?
We'll see. We're going to have 2 big test cases this year with LaMelo Ball and RJ Hampton, who are not players that went to the G League, but they're players that said, you know what, we just want to go to Australia. We want to play professionally. We want to get paid. So we'd seen this route. For those that remember, there's a guy named Brandon Jennings who used to play for the Milwaukee Bucks, had a brief stint with the Knicks, but he went to play in Europe. He was a top top 3-4 guy. He didn't want to go to college. He wanted to get paid. I think he got $1 million for the year. The problem is when you go to a European league, nobody speaks English. So no, I want to say nobody, but it's obviously not the predominant language, and the teammates you're playing with. So it's probably going to stunt your growth in some sense that you can't speak, you can't run plays, you can't talk to your coach.
You don't get the mentorship. Yeah.
Right. So we saw a different route that LaMelo Ball and RJ Hampton created by going to Australia, an English-speaking country. So those guys are both going to be lottery picks in some way, shape, or form, top 10, top 3. So we'll see. I mean, this new route that's being carved out, it's not the same, 7-figure money that you'd get from a European league or an Australian league, but there's also the comfort of not leaving this country. Maybe you're staying, relatively close to home. Maybe your family can come with you at a cheaper cost. So $500,000 is roughly what the G League money is going to be for these top guys. And maybe that's, you take that. You take $500,000 to stay domestically as opposed to getting, zero from college or having to go to Australia in a foreign country for, maybe a little bit more.
Okay, so I keep this a secret from most people, but these AMAs have made me more willing to share.
I'm so excited right now.
My personal side. I unfortunately live in Boston and am a Yankees fan, so that causes all kinds of problems for me. So I usually keep that a secret, but I bring that up only because I'm very interested in all the things you've said about the Astros and the cheating scandal and the way that it's been handled. We can have fun with this because, again, I think this is a nice break from all the news of COVID and everything else. But I'm also very interested in what sort of precedent you think this sets for the integrity of sports in general. But let's start with, do you think that the Major League Baseball handled this well? What would you have recommended they do differently?
So I guess there's two decisions that we should kind of pop into. So the news yesterday is that the second shoe dropped. There was the Houston Astros investigation, which concluded in January. There were a handful of punishments issued. And then yesterday we had the announcement of the Red Sox investigation and their punishment. So I don't think I'm saying anything unpopular where I think everybody universally viewed baseball's handling of the punishments as just, we'll say, not the greatest, to put it lightly. So I think
is there a legal framework that you can apply to this? I mean, should the GM, where does the accountability from a legal, I almost view it like a lawyer, who is responsible for mandating the proper operations of this business? And if the Astros are a business, where's the, accountability lie? It's like an Enron example where, the executives claim they didn't know what was going on, right?
Well, I guess I'll zero in on one point where I think is the closest we can get to a legal argument here. So, people want to say that there was no evidence found on the Houston Astros players as why they weren't punished, which is not the case. Commissioner Manfred was very clear that the reason that Astros players weren't punished because there was a technological ban that was issued. They couldn't use Apple Watches or any type of technology. So there was a memo that was emailed to the general manager and I guess to the manager in some sense. So when it came to the Astros in particular, the MLB investigation found that memo in its, the summary or whatever it entailed was not relayed to the players. So whether you think it's right or it's wrong, Manfred said he didn't think it was fair to punish players because he didn't know if they were, aware that technologically was illegal. I mean, I had the pleasure of working for an NFL team in the New York Giants for 4 years. Even if the GM didn't tell you something, I mean, people go on Twitter, people have friends on other teams. You might have heard it from somewhere else. I don't really know if I buy that argument, that just because they weren't told by the one particular person above them in the chain of command that you can't punish them. But that's where the lawyer argument comes in. I mean, I would say that even if they didn't have actual notice, right? Let's say someone didn't tell them. I think everyone's pretty clear, right? You probably can't use technology in some way to cheat and use allegedly trash cans or sensors and buzzers. So it's actual notice, constructive notice. I just think in that sense, Major League Baseball is not a court, so they can do whatever they want. They're a private company. But when it came to notice, I thought that explanation was a little light.
Okay. Well, again, I think as most baseball fans agree that a lot of this stuff tends to get what is the legal term?
Arbitrary?
No, enforced on the field. So the litigation will happen on the field, and I think everybody's been watching that closely. And that's another crazy piece of this thing, which is, you saw the Taiwanese baseball. It's they're already brawling and they're supposedly under lockdown and supposed to be staying away from each other. So it's the unwritten rules of baseball, as Jack Barlow says. Yeah.
I guess I'll just hit this quick. I mean, Taiwan baseball's being played in Taiwan right now, and it's naturally baseball can be played because everyone's already social distancing. So if you can have that in some way, shape, or form in Arizona or Florida, fine. The question happens when you have something like a potential Astro situation or a beanball, it hits someone in the back. Well, how are they going to prevent just a spontaneous brawl from occurring? What do you have? You increase the punishments, you quadruple them, you fine guys $1 million if they have a brawl. I don't think they can enforce that part of it. And I'm curious to see how they try to work around that. You can have a guy, the first baseman and the second baseman, the shortstop, but the second, you kind of have martial law and guys are going after each other, you kind of lose all semblance of social distancing.
I think we just achieved my goal for this AMA, which was to construct a COVID social distancing baseball brawl with a lawyer. That was definitely a career goal of mine. So listen, I appreciate you. I know you need to run for other commitments, but this was fantastic. Appreciate you bouncing around and doing this with the team. I'm going to let everybody who wasn't able to join us, because there were a lot of questions I got offline on LinkedIn about some of your tweets and things, which was fun. Keep up the good work, man. I really love just seeing you sound off on things, and it really provokes me to think differently about a bunch of different issues that I think a lot of executives are dealing with. A lot of people are afraid to confront because I think they open up a lot of Pandora's boxes. If there are multiple Pandora boxes out there, it's a challenge for a lot of people to think through the different decisions they need to make right now. And I appreciate you coming by and playing along here, Dan. Thanks for your time.
Josh, my absolute pleasure.
Of course. Well, listen, you take care of yourself, take care of your family and your dog, and have a great one. Gina, you want to wrap us up?
Oh, and I should mention, Josh, I'm at Sports Law Lust on Twitter. If anybody wants to follow me.
You should mention that. You guys should follow Dan on Twitter because he's a hoot. He mixes in all the legal knowledge that he shared with us today, but he's incredibly fluent in being able to bounce around these issues, and it's a good laugh sometimes too.
And dad jokes. I got a couple of them.
I didn't mention your dad jokes, but I'll let Gina wrap up now so we don't have to hear any of those. Gina.
Sounds good.
You're on mute, kid. You're on mute. Gina. Mute.
All right, sorry, let's try that again.
I thought you were telling a dad joke and I was all lined up for it. No dad jokes, Gina? All right, thank you guys again.
We'll send out Dan's Twitter handle along with the video recording of today's session. If you want to keep chatting with Dan or any of our guests or participants, please join our Slack community, bit.ly/join/SIL. And then as we continue to think about what it looks like when fans do come back into the venues and stadiums and how venues and stadiums need to prepare for letting fans back in, we have a very exciting AMA for you next week on Tuesday, where we have Julie Johnson Roberts, the co-founder and CEO of Armored Things, and Ed O'Brien from Clear. So definitely one not to be missed when we talk about the safety measures that need to be implemented to get fans back into the stadium. So thank you guys for joining us. We'll see you back here next week. Have a wonderful and safe weekend. And thank you again, Dan.
Bye, everybody. Stay safe.
Bye, everyone.